quote, tax on the rich. And we had this Twin West legislative breakfast, and along with that, he proposed a business-to-business sales tax. And so we were asked for the legislative question of the day, what do you think of that? And one by one, the legislators, we took the microphone and just railed on the business-to-business tax. I mean, every one of us. We did not know Governor Dayton was standing in the doorway listening to each one of us. And so he comes just stomping into the room and he grabs the microphone and he says, fine, the B2B tax is done, off the table. And so that was the power of listening, legislators, the public, and then speaking out against one's party and actually being effective in getting rid of something. But that wasn't enough for me because I was still very, very troubled by the fourth tier that did get enacted. So Republican Representative Sarah Anderson and I actually carried a bill to exempt small businesses, S Corps, and LLCs from that very really unfair tax. Education reform, I continually speak out. Many of you remember our fight to get alternative licensure so that Teach for America could be a tool to address the pressing achievement gap in our state. I carried that bill, I fought for it. Education Minnesota spent $2 million on TV trying to defeat that bill and me. And I've not been endorsing from them ever since that, as you can imagine. But we were successful, and with your help, we passed that. And with regard to the places you've differed from your party, Congressman Paulson, I'm curious why the League of Conservation Voters endorsed my candidacy and has your environmental record at a 16%, which I'm not saying is right or wrong, I'm just curious about that.
Are you curious enough to answer it?
Maybe I'll answer it this way, because Terry's campaign takes money from special interests as well, and she has taken other PAC money and she uses that money. So the pledge is not about fundraising. The pledge is not about money that is raised by our individual candidacies. It is about protecting and preserving and having accountability to the people we represent from outside organizations, be it the Koch brothers, be it the League of Conservation Voters, be it anyone that would spend money on our behalf and run lots of negative ads, which we all get tired of, which we don't like, but we can control our destiny. And it's worked in other districts, it's worked in other states, and that's what we should be signing and we should be agreeing to.
All right, I'll give you 30 seconds.
Okay. I'll do that if we both return our PAC money. All PAC money, and we just say this is going to be a race based on individual donors, and then let's go for it. I would. Are you ready?
You're going to sign the pledge.
Yeah, only under those conditions. You know, this has to be a level playing field.
You don't have that ceremony in ink just yet, but we're working on it. Let's move on to another topic, regulatory environment. There's been a lot of talk for a number of years, both in the state of Minnesota and federally, about burdensome regulations on business. Senator Bonoff, do you support pro-growth capital formation policies as well as legislation to update our financial regulatory system, such as the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act? And for those of you not familiar with what that is, it essentially requires the SEC to, about every 5 years, review regulations. How expensive are they? How burdensome are they in order to kind of unshackle business? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, we have to do all we can to remove barriers to economic growth, whether it's the small business barriers, the big corporate challenges that our companies face here. And I have worked hard on that in the Minnesota Senate, and I would continue to do that in Congress. This last session, there was an initiative going through that would have placed kind of a one-size-fits-all paid family leave, paid sick time. And as a value statement, of course, we all want employees and all people to be able to take care of their families, whether it's their little ones or their aging parents. But this particular proposal that was actually moving through with great steam put an unfair burden on all companies. If you were 50 or more, you had to offer a certain number of paid sick time, paid family leave, and you had to report on many occasions, and it created a whole new bureaucratic structure in government. And so in each committee, I could have just voted no, just quietly voted no, but I didn't. I actually kind of carried the water for the chambers, who were always in my office talking to me about it, and I went through that bill line by line and shared with my colleagues why it wasn't yet ready, how they hadn't gotten the business community at the table, how, when I was in business, when I was at Tonka Toys, the best benefit plan was the cafeteria plan where I could pick and choose. And how at Navarre Corporation, I got to negotiate to be home after school during a time period where my kids needed me and not lose my job. So you all need flexibility. You need to be able to do your business without government overreach and interference. And that's how I view things because I had that 20-year career in business, and I would continue looking at policy from that perspective.
And Congressman, your view of the regulatory environment?
Well, my view is this, is that we don't need more mandates coming from Washington that hurt and crush small businesses, especially capital formation, as you mentioned. Sure, regulations are important, but they also have to be balanced. And Terri voted to bring Obamacare here in Minnesota. We've had huge compliance costs as a part of that. I met with my community bankers. They raised the issue of the call report that they have to do on a quarterly basis, adding up to 4 or 5 days for someone with an advanced degree of a CPA and MBA having to dedicate their time and attention, rather than the time and attention should be enhancing their loan portfolio for capital formation. One of their banks said they had to hire someone on the outside at the cost of $25,000 just to complete the regulations. The fact is, we're in the worst economic recovery ever in the history of the country. More people are working part-time than want to work full-time. We've had more businesses fail and bought out or gone bankrupt in the last 6 years than have started. That's not what America is. We need to move forward on tax reform, regulatory reform, and have a cost-benefit analysis that is also assigned as a part of any time these regulations come forward. I'm an advocate for having Congress have to sign off on regulations of significant or major economic impact. And you can assign a dollar value to that, but we should be like a board of directors, no different than some of the companies that are represented here, where if we sign off on these regulations, the agencies are going to be less likely to propose harmful regulations. There's a better check and balance. But right now you've got an administration that is essentially through executive order doing things on the regulatory front that they can't do legislatively. And that's what's really been hurting our economy.
All right, thank you, Congressman. Let's move on to the continual issue of the national debt and the growing deficit. There is public debate, Senator, about how best to address that. As I said, it's a continual debate. It's been going on, I think, since I was born. If you are elected to Congress, what solutions would you offer to address these issues? And where do you stand on the issue of income tax increases or any tax increases at all at the federal level to address that?
So I am not for increasing our income taxes. I think that we need to do all we can in this fragile economic recovery to take tax burden off businesses and off individuals. There are common sense things that we can do. So one example is, because of my career in business, when I got to the legislature, I was looking at the amount of waste and inefficiency. I saw that in each state agency, they had an IT entire department that negotiated contracts, that had their payroll. In fact, in every agency, they had many duplicative departments, but in particular, IT was so costly. And so I worked with then Republican Keith Downey, who's now the chair of the party, and with Keith and Phyllis Kahn, we authored the IT Consolidation Act. And what that did is it said there had to be one CIO, and you could have the business units be served by that CIO, but one organization negotiated the contracts, made sure we were deploying our resources properly. I have now learned that we've saved $45 million of state dollars. There is example after example where I'm positive in our federal government, in the way they're organized, there's a tremendous amount of waste. Just like in the state, we do not do zero-based budgeting. Everything we do, things get piled on top of it and on top of it. It's like that in Congress too. We need to be able to use a performance-based budgeting approach. I actually authored that bill with Keith Downey as well. There isn't an appetite oftentimes in government for using these business solutions to lower costs. We can't afford to have the deficit. We can't afford to give the next generation the kind of debt we have. And again, that's why you've endorsed me, because I'm non-traditional. I bring those business-oriented solutions to the table.
And your time is up. You do, however, get extra credit for working Keith Downey and Phyllis Kahn into the same sentence. While we're in school, I'd be giving you that. Congressman, your view of the national debt, I know it's something you've dealt with ever since you've been in Congress. What solutions would you propose if elected for another term?
Well, my view of the national debt is it is crushing our future opportunity for our children and for our grandchildren. Going from $8 trillion with President Obama to now almost $20 trillion. And it is a huge amount of money. And unless action is taken, we will be in a situation where, like Greece or other countries, they have to implement austerity measures or raise taxes, which further kills economic growth. And I don't think that is the right direction to go. I have always supported balanced budgets, budgets that actually balance, budgets that actually pay down the national debt. Now, Speaker Pelosi, when she was Speaker, she doesn't believe in balanced budgets. In fact, the President has never, ever submitted a budget that balances. Ever. Never balances. He doesn't believe it's a priority. He does not believe that deficits are a priority. But we will go back from $500 billion deficits to a little over $1 trillion in just a few years. That's projected right now by the Congressional Budget Office because our economic growth is so poor and we are doing so bad. And I want to make sure that my daughters do have those same opportunities and choices that many of you have had in terms of starting your small company or growing your business or employing other people. I know that chronic care management is an opportunity I mentioned earlier within Medicare to literally be able to save dollars. Well, we've lowered discretionary spending at the federal level for 4 years in a row. That's never happened since the Korean War. That's primarily because House Republicans have been focusing and prioritizing on spending. There's an opportunity to deal with Medicare with chronic care management so that specialists are communicating with primary physicians, so that there's a risk-reward system where you care for the patient. Again, 68% of everyone of Medicare beneficiaries having a chronic condition, consuming 93% of the cost. If you have better coordinated care, you've got an opportunity to actually address the real cost drivers of our national debt. And that would be a top priority and will continue to be a top priority for me in Congress. And making sure, by the way, that my Republican colleagues are also accountable, because we got into this mess because both Republicans and Democrats spent more money than we have. And you put our country in a fiscal mess. And when interest rates go back up, it's going to squeeze out all of the priorities that we should be focused on as a country.
A couple of quick other issues I want to get to before closing arguments about the issues that impact the business community specifically. Let's talk about the minimum wage. And Congressman Paulson, I'll start with you. A lot of talk, especially in the Democratic primaries between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, about what level should it be, $11, $15. Your view of the minimum wage and as it pertains to business.
My view is that the minimum wage, as it's been set by the state, should be state policy. And there was a score that was done by the Congressional Budget Office not long ago when the president was advocating for increased minimum wages, that it would actually cost 500,000 jobs. And it's because a lot of small businesses, some of you in this room, employ people at minimum wage as a training wage, as a startup. And if you price these people out of the market for labor costs, guess what? You're going to get more automation. You're going to make it further difficult for other people to be employed and be trained and be able to take other jobs. And it's the wrong direction, but it's the wrong priority. The real priority should be tax reform, more trade policy, increasing economic growth, getting our country's fiscal house in order to actually help lift everyone's wages up.
And Senator Bonoff, I know you've taken on this controversial issue in the legislature. Your thoughts on the minimum wage?
Yeah, so it was very controversial when we took it on in the state legislature. And again, as a value statement, I would say that anybody who's working full-time shouldn't live in poverty. And yet the idea of having this, one wage for our entire country doesn't even make sense. If you look at the cost of doing business in New York City versus Seattle versus the Twin Cities versus Des Moines, I mean, how could you possibly think that the federal government should be able to say this is one wage? And I know when we passed a minimum wage, our minimum wage here in Minnesota was actually below the federal minimum wage, so we did increase that, but we've never been able to pass a tiered wage for waiters and waitresses, and that was one of the key priorities of the small business community, obviously those in the restaurant industry. And so I actually had the votes in the Senate to get that done, and I wrote a letter that was published in the Star Tribune about how important it was, and then on the final day of doing it, people kind of got cold feet, and so the Republicans in the Senate wouldn't go forward with it. But that's the kind of approach I would bring. It would be starting with a value statement, but then really understanding the nuances of things. Things are never just black and white. You have to understand the industry, who's in your community, and how you can use policy to actually support them rather than to put barriers in place. And I just have to say one more thing about the comment about that Congress should be more like a governing board. If you're a governing board, would you, as a board, vote against your CEO's policy no 50 times, or would you say as a board, let me offer you some direction, CEO, so that you can fix the problems that we see? Because I think that it's a cop-out to just say that the administration has done this or that if you want to operate like you really are leaders and you really do hold the power to change the direction of our country.
Real quick follow-up. So do you somewhat agree with him that minimum wage should be state policy as opposed to one size fits all?
Totally, I'm against that, yes.
Just want to make sure
Thank
before we head in, we
very
got some
clear.
clear agreement. We got to make sure we're
We agree.
clear on that. We're going to do 1 minute on this last question before we get to closing arguments. Senator, I'll start with you. Been a lot of talk at the federal and state level about mandatory family and medical leave. Where do you stand on that issue? You have 1 minute.
Yeah, so I told you that big story. I posted here, and I posted for a reason, because every business is different, every situation is different for an employee. There was some talk about you had to have predictive scheduling, and you know, I grew up in this family-owned business, Jackson Graves, where it was a retail operation, and during Thanksgiving, you know, you'd have less people shopping. During the Christmas season, you needed them to, you have to be able to respond and react to what's happening in the marketplace. There's no possible way that many of these customer-oriented businesses could use a, quote, predictive scheduling model. So I'm just not for any of those mandates. I think that government should be a regulatory body to protect us against the Flint, Michigan, and bad water, and to go after bad actors who aren't treating people well, but come from a basis of trust. Trust that businesses are filled with people in this room who do the right thing.
Congressman, 1 minute on this issue.
I don't, also, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think more mandates from Washington is the direction to go. You can apply that to education. You can apply it to healthcare, which Terri supported bringing Obamacare to Minnesota. A lot of new mandates that have forced people with fewer choices for their doctor. They can't have the healthcare plan that they relied on. And I guess regarding trust, it's a matter of making sure you're able to trust your own CEO of your legislative body. It's not the president, it's actually the Speaker of the House. Remember, we got Nancy Pelosi, who said you had to pass the health care law to find out what was in it. And that's why we're living under this. That's the wrong way to pass laws. That's the wrong way to move legislation forward.
All right, thank you, Congressman. We have now come to our closing statements. Each candidate will have 3 minutes for their closing remarks. We started earlier with Congressman Paul.